So I'm thrilled to have been given the opportunity to exploit Philip Ursprung's planned visit to Texas by having him join our Cullinan series this fall. Philip contacted me over the summer to tell me he was coming to Austin to give a talk and seminar at UT and asked if he could come down, visit Rice, and say hello. I'm not sure that he realized that such an innocent request would lead to his spending an hour with the Brocken talk, another hour with the first-year graduate students, and tomorrow a 2-hour interview with the Cullinan students in addition to this talk. I've never met Philip before. I'm very grateful that this hello could be so stretched out. The topic of the image is at once extremely familiar and yet also ever-evolving. While we all know the cliche that a picture is worth 1,000 words, we also know that looks can be deceiving. We generally share a wariness of the image and the power that it holds over our discipline as well as our culture at large. Already a quarter century ago, Hollenbach noted in his text Rhetoric of the Image that he said, quote, "The image is felt to be weak in respect of meaning. There are those who think the image is an extremely rudimentary system in comparison with language, and those who think that signification cannot exhaust the image's ineffable richness." Philip himself works through text, not image, even if his topic is the image. Trained as an art historian, he wrote his dissertation on Berlin art criticism in the late 19th century, and his habilitation, I'm not quite sure how to explain that distinction in the US system, but essentially if you're a historian in Europe, especially in Switzerland, you end up doing essentially a double dissertation. So they've got it really bad over there. So he wrote his habilitation on land art. This duo of topics is telling, for it foretold his subsequent and ongoing work as an art and architecture critic and curator, in addition to his work as a historian. It also points to his breadth of interests, which cross the boundaries of art, architecture, theory, history, criticism, and academia seamlessly and seemingly without effort, as evidenced perhaps most directly in the beautifully designed exhibition and beautifully written catalog that he did for the CCA in 2002, Herzog and Meuron, Natural History. He holds a chair in the History of Art and Architecture at the ETH in Zurich. Finally, I do have to underscore that with images, but also with speakers, things may not always be what they appear. For all his apparent Swissness, note the title slide, Philip is, in fact, an American, born not in Switzerland like Le Corbusier, but in Baltimore like John Waters. Maybe that, in fact, explains his fascination with the image. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very nice introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me and expanding the hello to such an exciting set of meetings. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here and to participate in your debates here at school. So I want to share some thoughts about Herzog de Meuron and about images with you. On the right, you see Kurt Forster, who was my mentor and boss at ETH Zurich. This is our first excursion we did together in the early 90s to the building Ricola Laufen by Herzog de Meuron. He later left Zurich and became director of the Canadian Centre of Architecture in Montreal, and asked me in 1999 to curate an exhibition about Herzog and de Meuron. My reaction was somewhat lukewarm. This is a shot of the exhibition in Montreal, which then traveled to London, Rotterdam, Munich, and Basel. On the one hand, I could not resist such an offer. On the other hand, I had never been a fan of architectural exhibitions. I was more used to curate and visit art exhibitions and had so far always been disappointed by architecture exhibitions. The abundance of documentary photographs, plans and models that refer to something that stands either at another place or no longer exists frustrated me. I always left such exhibitions with a sense of culpability, namely that I should be where the actual buildings are, or at least where they are developed, for example, in the studio of the architects. Of course, I realize that the problem resides in the very nature of architecture, which cannot be exhibited as such. Exhibiting architecture is a paradox. It is as challenging to architecture as the exhibition in the public realm is a challenge to art. Furthermore, at that time, I was not a real fan of Herzog and de Meuron. I admired the breakthrough project, the storage house Ricola Laufen in a quarry near Basel, which is 87 built, very modest, brief. It's an automatized storage hall where herbs and candy are stored. And the budget is about $500,000. It's basically to decorate the facade of this storage hall. And they did this by cladding this facade with a structure which is basically Eternit, cement and wood. In some sense, the storage hall seems to react to or read the wall of the quarry that is the place where it stands. One cannot enter the space. It is a closed space. It's only for machines and robots. And in some sense, the invisible space from the interior is squeezed outside and then stacked as a facade at the outside. It became known through this image by the German artist Thomas Ruff, who was commissioned by the architects to represent the building. Ruff was not interested in architecture photography. He never saw the building, never went there. He asked a professional architectural photographer to make pictures and then mounted these pictures in '91 with the help of the newly developed Photoshop program on his computer. So it's an electronic montage. You cannot see the building in this form, but the image shaped the reception and the perception of Herzog de Meuron in the years to come. I also had witnessed the prodigious growth of the office during the 90s after early successes with buildings such as the Blue House, the Stone House in Tavole, Italy. They became famous with projects such as the Götz collection in Munich, the Dominus winery in Napa Valley, and of course Tate Modern in London, which opened in 2000. Projects in the United States besides the Dominus are the Young Museum in San Francisco, the addition to the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, and here is the plan for the Miami Art Museum, which is now being planned. Shot I made this summer in the studio of Herzog de Meuron. Here is Christina Binswanger, one of the partners, looking or showing me the plans. Other projects are the Laban Dance Center in London, the Schaulager in Basel, and Prada, Tokyo. And here the soccer stadium in Munich, the Allianz Arena. The office was founded in 1978 by Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron, who both had studied at ETH Zurich, and it grew considerably during the 90s and is now structured by a series of partners and associates and has about 350 employees, mainly in Basel, some branch offices where larger projects are running. One is in New York. But so despite my admiration for their success, in 2001 they got awarded the Pritzker Prize, I had difficulties to identify with the architecture. I rejected the minimalist attitude with which they were associated. They were declared the protagonist of a reductionist, formalist approach which was identified with Swiss minimalism. Here is a project for the Art Box in Bonn, Germany, which was not realized. To me, something was missing in their buildings, but I could not really say what it was. Then I went to see a small building which had been completed in 1999, namely the Eberswalde Technical School Library. Eberswalde is a town located an hour north of Berlin in Brandenburg, which formerly was part of the German Democratic Republic. The old industrial city, which was destroyed during World War II, was infamous for its high unemployment rates and its skinhead gangs. It seems surprising to find cutting-edge architecture in such a place. However, after the reunification of Germany in 1990, the East renovated its system of higher education, and many important projects for new university campuses were built, among them Cottbus, also a library, also by Herzog de Meuron, also after a competition. So these are very low-budget projects. Eberswalde, for example, was only designed on the exterior by the architects because the project's budget was so low that the whole interior had to be given to a local firm. The moment I saw the building, everything I had thought about the architects changed. What I had missed was there. I felt a shock, a kind of visual rupture. For a moment I was hesitating if this was real or if I was dreaming. As if to answer my doubts, two children approached, touching the facade gently with their fingers. Of course, the moment I took my camera to photograph them, they stopped touching the facade and the post. So why did this building strike me as something different? First of all, it was not what I had expected from looking at photographs, where it looks massive, almost like a bunker. When I first perceived it, it seemed small and fragile. Its grey-greenish color and its size distinguished it from the context in a way that made the whole scenery look artificial. It was as if someone had punched a hole in the continuum of space and time. The urge to touch the facade that my students felt when we returned later that year shows how much the project deals with the limitations of mere visuality. I'm not the first one to observe this strange quality. In the projects, Terry Riley had remarked a ghost-like quality of their projects, and the architects themselves speak of their buildings as, quote, ruptures in the urban web, which may at first sight even seem violent. Among the photographic representations of the library, only Thomas Ruff's electronically mounted work of art, Bibliothek Eberswalde 2000, does justice to the project. Two transparent, ghost-like students are passing by. So the image deals with the problem of simultaneously depicting the building, its surrounding, and people on one representational level. We don't exactly know what time these students talk about. It could be 50s or 60s. Is it East Germany, West Germany? It's not really clear. So they cannot be represented on the same level of representation as the building. While I was taking pictures, I thought of Robert Smithson's essay, The Monuments of Passaic, written in 1967, where he stops at the bridge and encounters his first monument. He writes, quote, "Noonday sunshine cinema is the sight. turning the bridge and the river into an overexposed picture. Photographing it with my Instamatic 400 was like photographing a photograph. The sun became a monstrous light bulb that projected a detached series of stills through my Instamatic into my eye. End of quote. In fact, the facade can be read as a series of film stills. The motifs are repeated horizontally. One could, of course, establish a genealogy of buildings with decorated facades and revert to, for example, the library of the University of Mexico City or the decorated houses in the Engadine. But I'm less interested in the typology of the building than in the way images are conceived. As I came closer, I realized that they are inscribed into the concrete panels and silk-screened onto the glass panels. The architects had developed a special technique to do that. The images are taken from newspaper photographs that the artist Thomas Ruff had in his archive, and then sort of transferred with a silk screen technique on concrete, so that the parts that are dark are rough and the light parts are smooth. So it's not colored, it's the surface texture which makes the impression of light and darkness. So it's impossible sort of to focus completely on the motifs. One stumbles over the materiality of the panels. It is impossible to make abstraction of the physical support while receiving the image, and it's impossible to make abstraction of the image while looking at the material. So it's a constant shifting, in a way related to the way the artist Gerhard Richter depicts blurred persons in paintings such as Emma, Akt auf einer Treppe from 1966. Eberswalde goes furthest in Herzog and de Meuron's intention to, as they say, soak the facade by images. And in fact, this soaking by images is a challenge to traditional concepts of spatiality. In conversation with colleagues at that time, I often heard that Herzog de Meuron were only interested in images, that their projects were superficial, just sort of glued on the structure. Of course, these critiques were issued, as usual, between classes or at the bar, at dinners. I mean, like that's normally the case. You don't say it openly and you don't print it, so it's this informal way. But you always heard the same stereotype critique. It's only at surface. Actually, I only read one published critique by Raphael Moneo, who criticizes the exclusive attention paid to the facade of the library, contrasting this with what he sees as a successful structure, namely the Dominus winery, which he praises for the, quote, exaltation and celebration of material itself, a material that needs no form, end of quote. So I find this interesting. Moneo is missing something in Eberswalde, which is not missing in Dominus Winery, which for me is a project that is much less interesting than Eberswalde. It's just the contrary. Now, is the winery less empty or hollow than the library, where, as I said, because of budget restrictions, the interior was designed by a local firm? Is Moneo interested in sculptural, physical space, where I am interested in imaginary, historical space? Is he an essentialist who is nostalgic for self-referentiality? In other words, the idea that the meaning of architecture resides in the reflection of its media? Is he interested in modernist depth, whereas I'm interested in depthlessness, to use a term coined by Frederick Jameson in the 80s? Is it about the difference between an absolute modernist spatiality and a coded postmodernist spatiality, historically specific and rooted in conventions, as Charles Jenks put it, and as Jeff Wall shows it in his Dominus Estates vineyard, which was commissioned for the exhibition, and shows how the building sort of merges with the surrounding landscape. argue that Herzog de Meuron were at that time, and probably still are, developing a new kind of spatiality. They neither adhere to modernist nor to postmodernist conceptions of space. In fact, they are a challenge to the very dualism between modernist and postmodernist spatiality, because they make clear how much these spatialities have in common. What obviously links the spatiality of, for example, Mies van der Rohe with the spatiality of Robert Venturi is the fact that their buildings are highly photogenic. They all presuppose space as an empty, abstract medium which can be filled either with things or signs, with objects or meaning, if you wish. Such a space works like a zone of free trade where things, visual codes, or meaning can freely be multiplied and shifted around. This is the space of diagrams that fascinates Peter Eisenman, the space of typological reference that fascinated the teacher of Herzog de Meuron, Aldo Rossi, and the space of globalized capitals, flows that fascinates Rem Koolhaas. These spatialities are open to mediation, and they translate smoothly onto a two-dimensional plane of photography. This is particularly evident for architecture which finds its fulfillment on the plane of photography. An architecture whose very essence is the play of transparency and opacity, dissimulation and revelation, reflections, distortions and blurring, a play that has fascinated architects from Mies van der Rohe all the way to Diller and Scofidia. This is their blur building for the Swiss National Exhibition in 2002. As a hypothesis, I would argue that there is an archetype of modernist and postmodernist space, namely Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace. As the literary historian Thomas Richard has shown in his book, The Commodity Culture of Victorian England, the Great Exhibition of 1851 established a specifically capitalist system of representation, which is commonly referred to as spectacle. In the Crystal Palace, everything was represented under one roof in a wealth of consumer goods. The products, this was the decision of the organizer, the products had no price tags, nor were the visitors allowed to touch them. So they were aesthetically distanced. The 6 million visitors who streamed past them could take all the more pleasure in estimating their value. They could relish their value in just the same way that they would soon be expected to delight in art for art's sake, l'art pour l'art. So Paxton's Palace created a palace, or a space that turned consumer objects into works of art, thereby marking the beginning of what Jean Baudrillard would call a phenomenology of consumption. The architecture became the setting of a material and conceptual continuity of consumers, viewers, and exhibit, from raw materials to consumer products in their most sophisticated and refined form, namely a work of art. The conceit was that everything that visitors could see was in principle available to everyone. As Thomas Richard says, the Crystal Palace was factory, museum, market, station, and theatre in one. So this space was perfect and could not be improved upon. As critics already said at the time, it could only be repeated in an endless sequence of crystal palaces. So this prophecy was fulfilled. The spectacle proved to be long-lived. In his book, The Society of Spectacle, published in 1967, Guy Debord opens with the observation that, quote, the whole life of those societies in which the modern conditions of production prevail presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacle. Until today, most architecture still stands in the shadow of Crystal Palace. Shopping malls and representative architecture here, Bundestag, the former German parliament in Bonn, photographed by the German artist Andreas Gursky, promised that merely by establishing eye contact with what is available, people will have a share in consumption, politics, or knowledge. The space of spectacle allows maximum continuity and flexibility. In the hands of Mies, the headquarter for Bacardi rum can become a museum. In the hands of Koolhaas, language turns into space. In the hands of Dylan Scofidio, water turns into a cloud, which turns into a landmark, which turns into white noise. On the other hand, the projects by Herzog de Meuron, I would argue, resist such translations and multiplications. They come up with tangible alternatives. The architecture does not function as a stage set for a somewhat anachronistic logic of representation, but operates rather as though the buildings themselves were exhibits in a larger, yet unfinished exhibition. But none of their projects could ever be described, like the Crystal Palace, as palace, station, and museum in one. Many of their buildings have titles or names, like Blue House, Wooden House, House for an Art Collector, House for a Surgeon, House in Layman, and so on. Sometimes they even switch names, but they always have this name that identify them. They appear like actors who are not subject to a given plot. Again, Robert Smithson comes to mind, who once wrote, quote, "Artists should be actors who refuse to act." In 2003, Prada Tokyo was inaugurated, the flagship store of the Italian fashion enterprise. In many of the very wealthy cities of the world, Prada owns showrooms which are renowned for the specific greenish atmosphere. In these showrooms, fashion is displayed not like consumer goods that are piled up and labeled with price tags, but rather like rare, priceless works of art, which are displayed in art gallery on large pedestals. Here is another photograph by Andreas Górski called Prada. It makes clear that the display system as such, the very space produced around consumer goods, has become more important than the consumer good themselves, more important than the label or logo, and even more important than any kind of lifestyle that might be associated with the product. Now, in the case of Prada Tokyo, I would argue that the display system is not so much used to create a specific atmosphere and to set the stage for consumption. It rather becomes an apparatus, a machine that enables one to see the world in a different way. The facade of the building is made from innumerous concave glass windows. They resemble glass lenses that distort and reflect the view like a prism or a crystal. So the whole building becomes an optical device, an experimental tool to explore the mechanism of perception and to produce new images of the world. Of course, it would be naive to say that the projects of Herzog de Meuron do not mediate and are not photogenic. Dominus Winery was a spectacular backdrop for a portrait of star architect Jacques Herzog on the cover of New York Times magazine. In London, you can find lollipops in the shape of Tate Modern, and before it even was finished, the people of Beijing would flock to the construction site of the Bird's Nest and photograph themselves like if they were in front of some kind of natural landscape, including myself. It would be equally naive to suggest that they want to resist the gravitational field of spectacle. I would argue that architecture cannot completely escape Crystal Palace capitalist logic of representation and produce an anti-spectacular space. But still, I would make a difference. I would interpret projects such as those by Koolhaas or Dylan Scofidio as constructive critique of spectacle, one that aims at improving its object of critique while retaining its basic set of values and by updating a traditional system of representation. I thus see Kohlhaas and Della Scofidio as legitimate offsprings from Crystal Palace. And one of the elements which might support this hypothesis is that Rem Koolhaas, for example, tends to sublimate capitalism, to transform it into an image, to naturalize it. This is a shot that our cameraman took earlier this year when we had Rem Koolhaas and Bernard Tschumi at ETH Zurich for a talk, conversation. And on the screen you see this graphic representation of the deregulation of the exchange rate after the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1971, when suddenly the stable system of currencies starts to explode. This is, in a way, the birth moment of globalized economy. And the two architects were completely fascinated by this image, as if they were looking at a Caspar David Friedrich representation of some kind of gigantic thunderstorm, because this, in a way, was the landscape, or is the landscape, which is the basis of their work. Herzog and de Meuron, on the other hand, aim, at least from my perspective or in my interpretation, at an alternative to this dominant spatiality. Their agenda recalls Henri Lefebvre's critique of abstract space, articulated in his book, The Production of Space, published in 1974. This book is an attack against mechanistic ideologies. It is against modernism and postmodernism, structuralism and post-structuralism, against Sartre and Foucault and Derrida. So this is actually, I didn't put this on the reading list, but it's also a book which I strongly recommend. It's like being in a jungle with someone that has a big sword and sort of opens paths in every direction. Sometimes he hits in his own foot, because it's also in some way against itself. It's full of internal contradiction, but it does not leave any system coherent. So it's a very liberating way to depict the situation, in my view. So, and this amount of negation in the book, I don't know if anybody ever counted the no's that are in this book, but this constant negation recalls Herzog and de Meuron's own strategy of constant opposition. So every time I meet Jacques Herzog and tell him that I think I found out something about him, he says, no, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that. So we all know that he was very much influenced by Aldo Rossi, and I just published a piece on that and showed him that. He said, no, Rossi was not important. So it's at the moment you pin something down, it's no, and the whole system shifts. Lefebvre's idea of a unitary theory, where physical, mental, and social spaces merge, applies readily to the architectural practice of Herzog and de Meuron. Lefebvre's unitary theory deals with the crucial question of monumental space, which offers, quote, each member of a society an image of that membership, an image of his or her social visage. For Lefebvre, modernist architecture has failed to produce monumental space, such as cathedrals where visitors, quote, become aware of their own footsteps, or a Greek theatre where, quote, space, music, choruses, masks converge with language and actors. How could the contradiction between building and monument be overcome? He asks. To him, one of the reasons for the failure of contemporary architecture is the fact that most modernist facades disappear in the, quote, abstracted space where everything can be viewed from every aspect. This is precisely what distinguishes Eberswalde from Dominus. Eberswalde cannot be viewed from every aspect. But seen from certain angles, I would argue it offers certain people an image of their social visage. In Eberswalde, Herzog de Meuron has overcome the contradiction between building and monument. At the interface between the individual building and the urban space, they condense the abstract space into a substance that knits together the physical, the mental, and the social space. Another word for substance is image, what the French philosopher Henri Bergson in the late 19th century describes in his book Matter and Memory as something, quote, halfway between thing and representation. For Herzog de Meuron, the world is not empty but full of images. The facade of Eberswalde libraries does not a screen onto which images are projected through the medium of abstract space, but rather a dam that is soaked by the flood of images, that the phenomena of the world, our observations, our memory, our imagination are constantly producing. This is the thinking of Henri Bergson. We are all image machines. Our body is an image. Every image produces other images. So there's no such thing as an empty space. Unlike Aldo Rossi, for example, this dam or sieve is not a neutral frame to cut out and collage images from the past. Rather, it is informed, transformed by and through the very materiality of the images and transforms them as well. This might explain the popularity of Herzog and de Meuron, who seem to offer many audiences exactly the image they are looking for and offer them something very specific. And it might explain their preference for storage halls, museums, library, wineries, or simple attics, spaces that are already soaked with images and thus absorb further images more easily. Like if you have if you try to clean a wet surface, if you have a wet towel, it absorbs liquids more readily than a soaked towel. So in the built images of Eberswalde, whereas in all post-socialist areas the air is still thick with Western iconoclasm and repressed historical memory, the private and the public, the past and the future merge. Even the architect's private memories are amalgamated, since the facade can be read as a reenactment of the favorite work of art when they were students in the 70s, namely Donald Judd's 6 cold-rolled steel boxes exhibited in Basel next to Andy Warhol's silk screens. More obviously, the project imitates the socialist tradition of prefabricated concrete buildings, often decorated with images. And it refers to the complicated visual memory of East and West Germany. So I won't go into the iconography of the program. Just very briefly, the architects asked Thomas Ruff to select these motifs from his archive, and they could convince the client that was the good way to do, because apparently the concrete slabs were cheaper than a brick facade would have been. So including the fee for the artist, the whole facade was cheaper than standard brick facade. So you have a variety of images that refer to the library, to the tradition of the German university system. Here you have Alexander von Humboldt, for example, students working, an insect. Eberswalde used to be a center of insect collections. Here a Bauhaus building. And this is the most important part. It depicts the moment when the wall was built in Berlin in 1961, some people from the east fled out of their houses to the west. This was an iconic building in the memory of West German people. Everybody knew this image of people fleeing the house. In East Germany, the image was virtually unknown. So the client did not recognize the image and asked, why do you want to depict an image of a burning building on the facade of a library? And when they explained what it's about, they said, okay, but then we want also the happy end, namely the moment of reunification of 89-90, where the people gather in front of the Reichstag. So in some way, Eberswalde produces something which has not been fulfilled in other media. There is, even now, more than 20 years after the unification of Germany, no convincing image of this fact. There had just been a competition recently for a monument for the unification, which produced rather embarrassing results. And I would argue that with Eberswalde, the architects have actually managed to create something which is between monument and building and overcomes this separation and mediates to a broad public. So now I would like to say some words about the exhibition and the role that Eberswalde played for this exhibition. Again, I started to admire the work of Herzog de Meuron through my encounter with Eberswalde, and this also gave me kind of a key to open up the scenario for the exhibition. Exhibitions are for Herzog de Meuron a crucial element in testing their work. They are projects in their own right, with a budget, a project director. This is the first one they did in 1988, where they tested forms of representation by covering the windows of the Architecture Museum in Basel with large-scale, transparent, black and white photographs of their buildings, so the viewers could sort of perceive the images of their buildings and also read in the background the existing buildings of Basel. So they tried to make it sort of various layers of images overlapping. In 1995, they commissioned the artist Rémy Zaug to present their work at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, and Zaug developed this device which in a way translates their work into some kind of flatness and whiteness. So it makes the whole oeuvre into a spatial work of art, a very strong interpretation. It's almost difficult to identify projects by the architect. So again, if we start from the hypothesis that photography does not adequately reproduce the oeuvre, what kind of image can one use? When I was looking at the archive, I discovered this image, a shot of the concrete plates in a storage hall before the facade of Eberswalde was mounted. So I thought this is going to be the starting point of the exhibition, because it allows the viewers to sort of reconstruct the building in their imagination. So this became the guiding principle of the exhibition. We decided to establish a couple of rules. First rule was no documentation, namely no documentary photograph, no plans, no small-scale models of existing building, what Jacques Herzog calls bonsai architecture. When I visited the studio in Basel, I was fascinated to find hundreds of models standing around, but they're not miniature models of finished buildings, they're conceptual models which literally go from hand to hand to test ideas and facilitate the design process in an office that includes many employees. So these virtually go from hand to hand and transfer these ideas. It allows them to work with the division of labor in small teams where even the members of the team can change. So they continue to use this method up to the present. Next to these small models, they work with mock-ups. So here is, for example, the facade of the De Young in the courtyard of the studio, where they are tested sometimes over several weeks for dimension, materiality, color. Here you see a detail. This is very Swiss, of course, to prevent people from bumping their head into. So this is another thing which fascinated me, to exhibit these one-to-one models. The architects declare the conceptual models as waste, but being Swiss, they store their waste carefully. This is the archive where every of these wasted models is numbered and collected, fortunately for me as a curator, because this was all at hand. So I decided that I wanted to reproduce this experience for the visitors of the exhibition, namely the direct confrontation with the mass of models. The exhibition should produce an atmosphere of entering an unorganized archive or an old attic. It should provoke the urge to rearrange what one finds, a playful urge that one might experience in old natural history museums, not yet tidied up by eager curators. And I think everybody has this knows how fascinating these old museums are, where you are like the first archaeologist who discovers something, and you're not mediated through machinery and concepts by others. I wanted to pretend to be an archaeologist from the future who discovers hundreds of models in the archive without knowing what they mean. Like a curator of a 19th century natural history museum who arranged the bones of dinosaurs according to size, I wanted to arrange the models according to formal and morphological criteria. In addition, they should be compared with works of art, with objects of all kinds emerging from the collection of the various venues we had planned for the exhibition. The second rule was each of the 1,200 objects of the exhibition is labeled. The things do not speak for themselves. I wanted to escape the modernist fetishization of the object, which seems to be self-sufficient. So I wanted to do something radically different than what happened in the exhibition Modern Starts at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, at the same time, where they tried to combine artifacts, works of art, and have them speak as if they were all sculptures, which are not identified. So there you had to really look for the labels. They were all hidden somewhere to not disturb this illusion of formal coherence. So by identifying the objects and interpreting them from an often highly personal point of view, I wanted to show the visitors that this was just one among various possible interpretations, and that they themselves were invited to participate in producing and distributing meaning. The labels should allow the viewers to know as much as the curator and the architects. At the same time, there was no point from which the entire project could be seized and overlooked. The exhibition itself proved to be not very photogenic. Just as we enjoy the visit of a natural history museum because it makes clear how contingent any system of classification is and how fictional order can be, I wanted to show that nobody, neither the curator nor the architects, knows the meaning completely. This was connected directly with the third rule, namely no wall texts. This was, of course, the toughest part to deal with the museum directors, because they always had wall text. The museum, as an institution, keeps silent. This has nothing to do with institutional critique. The museum paid for the exhibition and I was hired by them. Rather, I wanted to demonstrate that the museum cannot speak from the off and that it is not all-knowing. And not least, I want to demonstrate that the curator does not have to identify with the museum as institution, nor with the subject of the exhibition, with the architect. So I do not have to identify with what I exhibit. The tasks were divided. As curator, I selected the works of art and the objects from the collections, whereas the architect selected among their models and designed the installation. They invented a system of display, a sort of a hybrid between a table and a catwalk. These pedestals, which took an enormous amount of time and energy, and which were meant to be something different than vitrines. So the viewers were forced to slightly bend over to see what was there. This was another issue with the museum directors. I mean, this is ergonomically incorrect. You have to have this ideal distance, and we want people to move and to bend down if they want to clearly read the labels, except for kids who had the ideal distance then. And the museum wanted, of course, everything protected. so that security regulations were like you have 50 people with baseball bats simultaneously smashing onto the tables, and the object shouldn't be harmed. So they invented this plexi system, which is basically non-functional because it is very thin. We called it the sushi box. So it's just a little bit of plastic. It's against dust, but it's about it. And it's so fragile that it starts to move and, wobble, almost shiver if you approach. And astonishingly, this fragility had the effect that nobody touched it. So it was a much better effect than if you would have made sort of a safety glass structure over it. And they could use it for Prada Tokyo. So it was part of their design process to design the exhibition system of Prada Tokyo. So I'm just going to show you some examples of how we juxtapose the works of art. The selection of artworks was mainly made due to the hypothesis which kind of art had been important in the career of the artist. You have Joseph Beuys and Richard Archwager, Giacometti looking at Jeff Wall. So the artworks were like adults having a dialogue while the kids, the models, were hovering around and making a mess. Warhol, of course, looking over everything skeptically. Here, Donald Judd in the foreground. And then we like these formal analogies. Here, some color studies which sort of relate to Gerhard Richter. This was purely associative juxtapositions. There were also thematic threads which cannot be depicted in their projects, but they are important to understand how the projects happen. This is a project for a Greek Orthodox church in Zurich, where they wanted to start with the idea of the icon being the substance of the building. So instead of having a building and putting an icon into the building, they made the whole building out of icons. The material would be the icon turned into building material. Of course, the client did not accept this, but out of the failure of the project resulted a whole series of investigations into the relation photography, image, and building. This is Ricola's production site in Mulhouse, where the facade is made out of polycarbonate transparent sheets that refer to this motif that was chosen by the artist Thomas Rof. Of course, you can say it's related to a plant, and it's a factory for herbal plant candy. This is the image that Rof chose, and he chose it from a photograph made by the German photographer Karl Bloßfeld in the early 20th century. We found in the archive of the Berlin Art School the archive of Bloßfeld, who had been an extraordinarily boring teacher for 30 years. He made his students copy plants. This was very sought after in the late 19th century, for all kinds of decoration. So he made campaigns in the Mediterranean area to photograph and to mold particularly beautiful plants, leaves, and this was then the basis for the students to copy these motifs. Of course, after the turn of the century, nobody needed that anymore, and he must have lived with about 2 or 3 students over the years. It was completely forgotten until the Surrealists discovered him in the late 20s and exhibited him. And shortly before his death, he became world famous because all the photographs were published, and he became like an icon in the history of photography. So that was the first time that we could show these models and these vintage prints, which then relate to other issues of photography, like, for example, Jacques Herzog's fascination for photography on porcelain, so a fragile medium on a fragile medium. And the Canadian Centre for Architecture happens to own a collection of library photographs that a librarian gave them, that of course have never been exhibited because of their sheer ugliness, but they fit very well into our concept. And so this is the the overview in the end, where we exhibit the original slabs, or the spare slabs from Eberswalde, like almost archaeological finds in their crates, all the way up to this depiction by Thomas Ruf. Other topics are architectural toys that relate to their conceptual models, where they try to arrange and rearrange parts. The Chinese scholar rock as another conceptual model that combines the natural and the artificial. So we had a big collection of these scholars' rocks. We also were asking ourselves, can one represent these basically worthless conceptual models with very expensive works of art, like this 1.5 million reliquaire from Limoges, which was secured by some satellite security system because it's so cherished? Can one show them next to each other? This was something which we could not know in theory, which was just tested, and I think fortunately it worked. So it did actually take place. So to conclude, the material in Herzog de Meuron's architecture does never speak for itself. It is not, and this is where I completely disagree with Raphael Monet, it is not celebrated for its own sake, nor is it totally transformed. Rather, it is always confronted with an unexpected other and comprises internal contradictions. This, for example, is the asphalt in front of Tate Modern, where you have these pebbles from the Thames River which are inserted into the asphalt. You have the new and what was before, the artificial, the natural, different temporalities which are intertwined, but you cannot separate them completely anymore. They are less interested in dualistic sets, but rather in the articulation of contradictions which remain intertwined. And just like they intertwine different materials, they also are interested in modifying older buildings. From the early reconstructions of apartments and houses in the late 70s, normally the first opportunities of a young studio, they went on to spectacular museums buildings such as Küppersmühle, Grote Collection in Duisburg, and the Tate Modern. Unlike most of the colleagues, however, they are not interested in a dialogue between the old and the new. The relics of the old are never isolated or conserved or cherished, but rather transformed into something new, which breaks off the bridges to the past, but which nevertheless is not conceivable without it. So, for example, they close the old windows of this mill. Here they close them as if the facade goes blind, so to say. But then they cut the facade with these new windows, which make clear that there is a white cube and a new function inside. So the building seems to vaguely recall its past, and then the light of the white cube enters through new slots that are brutally cut through the wall. The same goes for Tate Modern. They maintain the aura of the machine hall of the former power plant, not by preserving details or by but by consciously exaggerating its dimensions. It's already a high building, but they make it higher by lowering it, by having this ramp and squeezing the galleries to the edges. So they make the already empty space even more empty. But you will not find any rusty chains or any relics of machinery. So this whole fetishization of the old, which you have in most buildings dealing with the past, does not happen. There's grey paint covering it. So there is no dialogue with the old possible. One can say the visitors can hardly find any traces of the past. The past is incorporated but not sentimentally evoked. It is represented as something which disappears for good irreversibly, but which nevertheless remains intertwined with the present. Thank you for your attention. Yep.
In the exhibition, you showed images of other artists and workers splatter painting next to Herzog's model. And also you talked about how you showed pieces of art that inspired Herzog and Meuron that they've been inspired from throughout their life within the same exhibition. Is that true?
I didn't get it acoustically.
The second part was like also, did you also say you showed art that Herzog and Meuron themselves had been inspired for in the exhibition? Was it important for you to distinguish what was you associated with their architecture and what they brought to the table with their inspiration from their past?
No, the rule was I choose. We had a real division of labor and of competence. So the art was my chapter. So I interviewed them, I read about them, I extrapolated what kind of art I thought was related to the work, what kind of art made sense. Of course I asked them, is it okay to use that? But it was basically my interpretation, my choice. The same went for these artifacts. I decided, okay, I think this and this and this goes with what you're doing. In some cases, they thought we were slightly crazy if we chose, old felt boots from Siberia because we thought it's related to Joseph Beuys. It's a very complicated association chain. They thought this is just too much, but anyway, it's your choice. So we didn't always agree. I mean, mostly disagreed. But we said it's better to split up at this moment so that the stories are coherent themselves than to compromise. And of course, it was also about availability. We couldn't get everything, but we could get a lot. It was still the golden age of the CCA, and there was an almost unlimited budget, so we were very, very free to operate and have first-class works of art.
It seems super interesting exhibition. I'm wondering if you were also trying to almost write a new biography for Herzog and Meuron. Normally they wouldn't tell themselves.
Yes, that's of course the idea that it's something which they would not tell themselves. And that was agreed upon. The metaphor of natural history, in their view, did not do justice to the work because they like natural history museums, but they consider their work completely different than the 19th century, which is of course the place where the natural history as a metaphor, as a method comes from. So in their view, for example, they vetoed the idea to call the exhibition natural history. And then, of course, the museum also had their idea. So in the end, it was archaeology of the mind, which was, it's a very complicated title. But they said, no, the title position must not be natural history. The book, it's okay, because the book was my responsibility. And if I felt that was okay, that was fine. But their work is not natural history. So there we basically disagreed. For them, it brought an aura of almost reactionary attitudes, which they wanted to prevent at any price. But they accepted the fact that the book has this name. Yeah.
How did your work respond to your presence in that exhibition? In a way, it's almost analogous to like a mystery science theater. It's this format of watching a movie, except you're actually really dealing with the dialogue between what the characters that are watching the movie. I mean, in a way, it's sort of biographical about you, autobiographical about you, as much as it's about them, possibly more so.
Yeah. It has a lot to do with what I'm interested in, and in a way, I also shape the narrative out of the material. So it was not the intention to hermeneutically understand how they work and to give sort of the true interpretation of their work. It was not the intention to help them sell their work to potential clients. In the European venues where I was not curator anymore, this changed, so it became more of a representative exhibition where the projects were clearly identified on tables. In the Canadian situation where I was autonomous in some sense because I was hired by the museum, we had the freedom to experiment with a situation where we said, okay, we will not identify the projects. The museum was very reluctant. They said, well, viewers won't know what the project looks like. And we said, yes, but it's not possible to have all. So we have to live with the fact that they will not know what it looks like. And for the architects, that was fine, because it's not their intention to represent the finished project. For the museum, especially the didactical staff, we have to tell the people how the project looks like. And then in the end, we won, and 20% of the people in the end missed this information, and 80% liked it. So I think it's just not possible to have both systems of representation in this one set. Yeah.
There's one history of modern architecture that would run kind of like this. Basically, how do you get two things to come together in some elegant way, which in its late generation becomes a kind of fetishization of the joint. There's another history that could parallel that, which is, here's surface, how do you produce kind of appropriate surfaces, which in its late generation one could say Herzog and Meuron is fetishizing the surface, kind of like this, no longer the joint, no longer two things coming together, but the thing itself. Aside from the question of image, but the question of fetishization. Would you place Herzog and Meuron into that category? And if so, is that similarly problematic, say, with the kind of fetishization of joint that you see in, say, for lack of a better example, somebody like Chipperfield or somebody along those lines?
Mm-hmm. I think the surface has no meaning in the work, because it's basically you have the concept, and if there's surface, there's also something behind the surface. I mean, the critique of the work is, this is superficial. But if you follow Bergson or Lefebvre, there is no such thing as surface. Doesn't make sense. That's why I find useful this image, or this dynamic concept of the image. Of course, you have words like membrane or skin, but I think it's rather something which fits for projects such as Sanaa, where there's a more kind of a tectonic structure still around. You can still identify some kind of bones and some kind of skins. Of course, practically speaking, we can say, okay, Eberswalde, this is clearly a surface, and they just clad the facade with these concrete buildings. And my architecture students, my Swiss architecture students, when I went with them, they hated it. They said, this is not architecture. It was in 2001. This is not architecture. Whereas the artist students from Berlin, they loved it, because they said, this is a building, an image in space. So it doesn't really answer what you were asking. I don't think it's a fetishization of the surface. No, that's what many critics say they're doing. It might be a problem of architects that are sort of copying it. Now you have a proliferation of warehouses and shopping centers where you just hide the box behind a pattern and a beautiful surface. In that case, I would say yes, it becomes a fetishization of the surface. But they always try to find something which breaks this surface, to disrupt it and to intertwine it. It's also from Chipperfield's way, and I like your way of the fetishized joint, because in his narratives, meeting of the historical and the present becomes a sort of a drama or a melodrama, you can say. And in their view, I think their respect of the past is so big that they say we cannot understand it anyway. We can just show the collision. We can show the anachronism. Perhaps anachronism would be a term that is useful. There's these temporalities and they collide, but we cannot mold this into one surface. With projects such as the Allianz, the arena, the soccer fields, that there might be a more coherent surface. But then they put much energy into the fact that it can change its color, so it becomes an almost emotional facade. That if one team is losing, the facade turns red. So that's something where they try to break it again. So it's they do everything to prevent this continuity of spatiality and temporality that Joseph Paxton installs, to sort of smash the glass, to smash the windows, to say this is not possible, to say, okay, there's also no such thing as nature. If something green appears, it's sort of turned upside down. They let plants grow out of the facades. So it's like an anti-naturalistic approach, which is deeply skeptical towards any kind of concept that thinks nature exists as such. This cannot always work. I mean, sometimes it doesn't. There are many of the more recent projects which perhaps are not so successful in articulating these breaks. But the intention, I would say, is to disrupt the surface.
So you seem to be saying that they're not about space. You don't seem to be saying they have a different sort of space, but they're just not about space. Would you say that they have an urban strategy, or that there's an urban, or are they uninterested in urbanism? They just do objects.
That has changed recently. I would say the earlier projects are not interested, but probably nobody was interested in the late 80s, early 90s. They put a lot of energy into urban studies now. They established an own studio for urban studies, which is related to the ETH. They publish a lot on urban issues. It is probably still a comparably weaker point of their practices, even if they do even urban planning for China, for example. I would say it's not the strongest part of the practice, but they try to go in this direction. And if my hypothesis of Eberswalde is correct, Eberswalde is something which communicates on an urban level, or at least aspires to, because it deals with these historic and mental images which affect. It could not stand anywhere else, I mean, Mies van der Rohe can stand anywhere and can replicate endlessly, whereas their projects cannot. So they are always related to a specific urban situation. But I would say that this is one of the theoretical challenges or problems that they face now. That it does not translate smoothly onto an urban scale. But I'm not really sure if I understand it correctly what they're doing on this urban scale right now.
I wonder actually if this exhibition wasn't a paradigmatic moment in their practice, and after that their kind of focus somewhat shifted. Because I remember most of the projects up to then were these kind of boxes as the Eberswalde Library. And I remember myself working at Studio Basel, how suddenly this kind of obsession with polygonal forms started to kind of emerge and this kind of drive away from the stupid minimal box to something that's kind of spatially more exciting, or that one could understand as that. And I wonder to what extent that was maybe also a reaction to that criticism, but maybe also a reflection triggered by the exhibition and sort of look back on it.
Yeah, I can not really judge that. I mean, we never evaluated the effects of the exhibition. But I know that for them it was an important moment, that they put a lot of effort into it, and they still talk a lot about the exhibition. So it must have had an effect. But of course, also you cannot see this without relation to the history of the studio, okay? Because when we started the exhibition, it was still relatively small, and Jacques Herzog, he was correcting labels, so he took a lot of time in detail work, and every step was discussed over and over. And at the same time, the office almost quadrupled in its size. The structure was completely different, and the experimental side did not have this also economically this place anymore in the office. It was sort of shifted to Studio Basel then, I think. But they never, since then, they have not made another exhibition of this size. So this as a tool seems to have also changed in function.
I have a question about you talk about the library, you talk about it as a monument. I'd say, like, whereas Rossi saw the mergement of physical, mental, social, economic space as something that would be based on, say, continuity or permanence of form, that same merging happens, as you're saying, in Herzog and Meuron through disjunction. And I'm wondering if you see that as an updating of this idea of the monument as having a specific place and having a certain relationship of individual and collective identity. They're updating his idea, or if they're really positing a new type of urban monumentality.
Yeah, this is a complicated question, the relation to Rossi. I think they have a different conception of history, probably as everybody who is from a different generation. Rossi is still in an extremely historicist framework, and they leave that clearly. I mean, it's like today this is probably mainstream that we cannot operate historicistically anymore. We discussed this afternoon already. You cannot say I relate to Mies and Schinkel and all these generation issues, or I protest against my forebears, because there seems to be just one eternal present. You can move in space, but the linearity of history has lost its power. And Rossi is, of course, something who is like many of his generation, has a different conception of history, also a more tragic conception. History is something which is a destroyed unity, a collapsed unity. I mean, this is the post-war experience. It is the experience of deindustrialization of northern Italy, where something which was coherent collapses. And he, like Eisenman, of course, and artists such as Beuys or Richter, they have a sort of a tragic basis. History is something which is in ruins. Piranesi is very typical. They all are fascinated by Piranesi, by this world of ruins. And for Herzog, the world is basically okay. And of course, there is also a nostalgic impulse. You have this fascination for the small houses that you see in Jacques Herzog, for example, which is, I would say, reminiscence of the 50s, of his childhood, of the petit bourgeois scales. The little house appears in almost every project somewhere. It's like a rosebud of Citizen Kane. But history as such is it's not something which has to be fixed or put together again. And for Rossi, it has to be fixed. So it also means that Rossi has a situation where he takes some kind of distance and then goes and collects and makes montages. That's impossible for Herzog de Meuron. They cannot take a distance. The objects always are too close, and there is no such kind of conceptual scissors which allows to cut out something from the past and then put it together anew, because everything is constantly moving. If you take your scissors and the object has already changed. So it's like part of one eternal present, and that will be, I think, a difference. but where they probably meet is with the interest for the monument and the identification. I think that's something which they take from Rossi, and they want to offer it to the client and to people who use it. I think they generally think about people who use these objects and try to carve out some space for them.
All right, thank you very much.